Well, thank you everyone for coming. Welcome to you all, and thanks for joining us. So I'm Ellen Wiles. I'm a creative writing lecturer at Exeter University, and I'm delighted to be launching this mini-series called Speaking of Writing on behalf of the university's creative writing team. And it's this series of Friday lunchtime events featuring brilliant women writers of colour. So it's a huge pleasure to begin with an event focused on nature writing called Finding Words to Face the Biodiversity Crisis. And we're extremely lucky to have two excellent writers with us. There's Jessica J. Lee. Hi, Jessica.
Hi.
And Amanda Thomson. Hi, Amanda.
Yeah.
So Jessica J. Lee is a British, Canadian, Taiwanese author and an environmental historian. She's the author of two books of nature writing, Turning, published in 2017, and Two Trees Make a Forest, published in 2019. And Two Trees has just won the prestigious Western Writers' Trust Prize for Non-Fiction for 2020. And that's the largest prize for non-fiction in Canada. Two Trees is an exploration of how geographical forces are interlaced with our family stories. And you'll hear more about that shortly. Jessica is also the winner of the 2019 RBC Prize Emerging Writer Award. She has a PhD in environmental history and aesthetics and was writer in residence at the Leibniz Institute for Freshwater Ecology in Berlin from 2017 to 18. She is the founding editor of the Willow Hub Review, and she was a researcher at the University of Cambridge, and she lives in London. Amanda Thomson is not just a writer, but a visual and interdisciplinary artist as well. She's a lecturer in painting and printmaking at the Glasgow School of Art. She was originally trained as a printmaker, and her interdisciplinary practice is often about notions of home, movements, migrations, landscapes, the natural world, and how places come to be made. So her first book is a Scots Dictionary of Nature, published by Saraband, and her next book, Microbursts, will be a collection of lyric and intermedial essays that she's writing in collaboration with Elizabeth Reader, and that'll be published by Prototype next spring. Her writing has appeared in the Willow Hub Review, founded by Jessica, and the anthology Atlas of Water, Writing on Nature and Environment of Scotland, which was edited by Kathleen Jamie. She's exhibited nationally and internationally and has a PhD in interdisciplinary arts practice. She now lives and works in Strathspey in the Scottish, I don't think I've pronounced that very well, Strathspey in the Scottish Highlands, and in Glasgow. So let's start today's event by stepping into the landscapes of your respective writing, Jessica and Amanda, with some readings before we then move on to discussion and some questions. So Jessica, would you like to start us off firstly by introducing us briefly to Two Trees and then reading us a passage? Thanks.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for joining us. So Two Trees Make a Forest is, I always struggle to explain it, but it's a bit of a sort of hybrid memoir biography / nature writing book that follows the life story of my grandparents that I pieced together in sort of from fragments as they moved from China to Taiwan onto Canada, and simultaneously sort of traces my own journeys in the landscape in Taiwan to sort of find a common language between us and to sort of understand, I guess, that story of migration in their lives and sort of how that is, you know, at scale with sort of wider political forces, wider sort of global forces of migration and identity and movement and much more. So I'm going to read just a few pages from near the beginning. I should say in advance, my dog is in the room with me, so in case you see anything in the background, that's what it is, and hopefully he'll be quiet. I was 27 when I went to Taiwan for the second time. My first visit since I was a baby. Gong, my grandfather, had returned there and died a few years earlier, and my mother and I had gone to visit his remains. He had died alone, his memories wasted. It felt to us an irrevocable betrayal, though we'd had no say in what had happened, and we couldn't have changed it. Decades had passed since my mother had emigrated, but the island had called my family back. My mother began to talk about returning for good when she retired. I saw the ways she'd tried on a different life, on a different continent, and how it bristled her, speaking a language she'd inherited, asking her children questions in Mandarin and receiving a reply in English. We mocked her errors as children do, and she would reply, "Well, you speak Chinese then," joking, though I sensed a loss in her tone. I saw in Taiwan something of the ways that places draw us in and sometimes push us away again, and there grew in me an inarticulate longing. My mother and I spent the better part of that visit wandering the overgrown hills and trails outside the cities. We ventured to the south to Kunding, where she'd spent childhood holidays on the peninsula of coral. We soaked in northern rain in Yamingsan and delved into the fog that blanketed Toroko. It felt as if we were finding in the landscape an expression of this place and our lives beyond my grandfather's death, beyond a past I did not fully understand. I developed a love for these mountains and their forests, a need to return and return again. I lamented the years we'd stayed away. It wasn't nostalgia, a dangerous thing if it seized too narrowly, but still other words could not account for it. Sehnsucht, from my adopted language, German, a yearning for another course, for things that could have been different perhaps. Heirat, from Welsh, a homesickness for a past to which I could not return, came close. There's a Chinese word, shangqing, that means longing for one's native place, but none of them quite fit. Unable to determine my feelings with words, I began to think that perhaps whatever force had stitched my grandparents and my mother to this place had caught me with just a thread at first, and then bound me to it still stronger. My grief was displaced by deep affection. Does regret, by nature, transmute into longing? I do not think it was a unique desire. I know others, too, who have lost places or relatives who've taken comfort in returning, as if exercising a muscle memory passed down through the generations. I found a constancy and a comfort in walking the island's hills. And where I couldn't find words, I fell to other languages, to plants, to history, to landscape. My work as an environmental historian had taught me a great deal about temperate plants, navigating my way through a Canadian pine forest or a European heath with familiarity. In the vast and unrolling woodlands I grew up with in Canada, there's the red flame of autumn, the spare and silent retreat of winter. The pines and maples do their seasonal dance, pollen, senescence, bare branch. But in Taiwan, I found myself botanically adrift, as unsure of the trees as I was of the ferns that sprouted from windowsills. Taiwan's plants are too many to name. A green washes itself over Taiwan's hills, a mottled deep hue that reminds me more of lake than of land, of darkened waterweed more than tree. The green rolls out on the horizon, glinting with occasional light, but more often steaming with the low-hanging clouds that cling to the border between hillside and sky. That verdant hue is unlike any I know. Taiwan's hills form a natural boundary between the cities and the mountains. Camphor laurels, peeling elms, charcoal trees, banyans, and sugar palms are overrun with the unfurling of ferns beyond number, with giant taros that stand gaping under heavy rain. The parasols of the eight-fingered Diplofatsia reach their hands to the sky. Their many greens stand layered, saturated, and deepened. The island holds both migrant and endemic species. There are plants that came from the continent, carried by birds or other animals, by sea, or by air, or by the land bridge that once filled the Taiwan Strait when sea levels were lower many ages ago. Some came from the island chain to the east, Japan, while others floated atop the southern seas, sprouting on the shores. There are newer plants that arose only here. A quarter of them evolved in isolation on their island home. In Taiwan's plants, I saw both movement and change, species adapting to climate, to altitude, to soil. I met mimosa that curled at my touch, Dendrocalamus latiflorus from the Latin tree reed, sweet bamboos that swayed beyond sight. In my visits, I came to know them by walking, by crouching low to the ground to catch a scent, and by training the lens of my camera on their distant reaches. I searched books for a guide. I found in the works of 19th century British geographers a strange vision of the island. Their accounts of Taiwan's inner reaches held a trace of terror, the plants too foreign, the forests too thick. They wrote of the island as beautiful yet threatening, a wilderness overgrown. The sublimity of extremely high mountains found an analog just as readily in darkened woods. John Thompson, a photographer and fellow of the Royal Geographical Society, wrote of softly beautiful mountain scenery cut through with gigantic forests, where climbing parasitic plants, passing from tree to tree, formed a chaos like the confusion of ropes on a Chinese junk. That was a quote. These portrayals mingled beauty with fear, with curiosity and exoticism, occasionally with disgust. Though written in English, I struggled to find in them a language I could share. But this was the green my mother grew up with. She told me the Mandarin names of plants I had no reference for, passed on from my grandfather to her. Fanghuangmu, phoenix or flame trees, and bajiao, a fibrous inedible species of banana. Her childhood through the names of trees. I turned their names over in my mouth, stretching their shapes into my mind, and found in them a longing to remember the things I had not known. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jessica. And you'll all get a sense from the extract, if you haven't yet read the whole book, of the lush and evocative prose, how intricately it intertwines these explorations of nature with an interrogation of family, heritage, geological history, and identity. So Amanda, I think you'd like to read us a section from two of your works. So there's the Scots Dictionary and then your contribution to the Antlers of Water anthology. Fire away.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm just going to read a start from the introduction to this book, Scots Dictionary of Nature, which is my first book. I'm not going to read you just words and definitions, though I have been known to do that, but I'll just start by reading you a section from the introduction. In a second-hand bookshop in Edinburgh, I found an old dictionary of the Scots language, compiled by John Jimison, abridged by John Johnson, and published in 1846. The original price of £11 was embossed in gold in the spine, and I bought it for £20. In opening random pages, I'd come across words such as timber breeks, timber trousers, meaning a coffin, and deed shack, the sound made by woodworm in houses, so called from its clicking noise and supposed to be a premonition of death. I loved these words and more. They had a resonance and a particular feeling to them that was sometimes poignant and affecting, and sometimes conveyed a prosaic descriptiveness that nonetheless spoke of close connections and an attentiveness to the nuances of the landscape, what it contains, how we move through it, and even specific times of day or year. Breakback, the harvest moon, so called by harvest labourers because of the additional work it entails. There were also words like huam, the moan of an owl in the warm days of summer, evocative of that feeling of the haziness of a long, hot summer's day as it spills into evening. This old dictionary made me begin to wonder about lost connections to land and place, and perhaps even ways of seeing and being in the world, and I began wondering what else I might find. Between 2009 and 2013, I was doing a doctorate, and an element of my research related to the gradual changes that happen over time in the forests of Mauritia and Abernethy, and how, when one is familiar with a place, one sees more layers and begins to recognise the subtlest of these changes. I was interested in how we make sense of and articulate our relationship to the land, both visually and verbally. As I walked with foresters and ecologists, I came across words like gralach, used by a deer stalker to describe the innards of a dead deer, and the verb to gralach, which so viscerally describes the task of removing them. Such words were unfamiliar to me, and yet foresters and ecologists used them with ease and specificity to describe their everyday activities. As I listened and heard these new words to me, they informed additional ways of seeing and gave me different understandings of the places where I was walking and of the activities I was carrying out. An old forester told me about a man who started working in the Forestry Commission, but was not very good at his job. He was not wood material, as the forester said. I'm not a lexicographer or a linguist or a historian of the Scots language, but as an artist, I'm interested in words and language and how we might describe our world. In mining these dictionaries, I found words that are rarely heard, no longer in use, or perhaps largely forgotten. These found words evidence a confluence of local and social histories, alluding to changing ways of life and shifting connections, and point to fascinating relationships with nature and the land. So that was the introduction to a Scots Dictionary of Nature, which kind of gives you a flavour of what the book is about. And I'm just going to read from a piece I wrote for this lovely anthology, Antlers of Water, Writings on the Nature and Environment of Scotland, which I think maybe gives us a sense more of where I'm coming from as well. And it's about an island called Mingley, which is on the far northwest reaches of Scotland. And it's a kind of long boat ride I took to get there. Mingley, more than all the other islands, was the one that felt most remote, unmediated, but also felt a place that had been left left behind and left to its own devices. I should have guessed at the topology by Bonxi's patrolling along the horizon line and how the sound of the swell of the sea rose, the sudden quickening of air. But as we neared the sheer of the hill up from the bay, I expected to see over to a dip that would take us down to the other side of the island, maybe to another beach. Instead, I was met with nothing but air, cliffs and water, and seabirds wheeling and crying below me. My race, gender, class, age, the rest of the world seemed to fall away from me, just a little, and in that moment I was exposed, stripped back, just humans. Here, below us, it was all birds. Puffins and more puffins, guillemots and razorbills, fulmars wheeling high on the currents that pushed them up and over the cliffs so that they sometimes startled, so fast and close, and suddenly they appear. This landscape, this seascape, these cliffscapes are vital, alive with movement and noise, and if you lean too far over the thrift-fringed edge of the cliff, perhaps you get a better view, or yet another photograph of a puffin, the reek of guano rises to meet you. It's a place where you are both incredibly aware of yourself and where you are, at the same time, small and lost in the environment. After the sedentary, rich passivity of the boat, the gift of hours just to walk, to sit on the west coast cliff tops, or dip down steep promontories to see the puffins and razorbills which flew in and up, sometimes just landing, but often seeming to just tag the impossibly narrow ledges before falling away again. Perhaps they just didn't quite get the balance, the deceleration, the foothold they needed and had to fly off and around, come in again. We watched the paleness of kittiwakes in bright sunlight against dark cliffs and shadow, saw a shark basking in the waters below. Life pressed on life, and we entered into the life worlds of other species, overwhelmed by blue, black, white noise. In a forest, if you're paying attention, from a still start, you can sometimes hear a breeze approach before it encircles and passes through and over you. In the same way, looking out over the Atlantic from a cliff top, say in Mingulay, or off Store Point in Sutherland, you can see squalls form at sea and watch as they come in and soak you, or reach landfall a little way to the south or to the north, land lashed. You're sometimes made aware, tangibly, of a near future soon to arrive. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Such an immersive passage. I really felt like I was in a completely different place just then. And you can really see from these extracts Amanda's unique perspective on how expressive vocabulary and nuanced language can really enable us to appreciate nature and landscapes more deeply, and revealing how our connection with nature and localized landscapes is inherently cultural as well as physical and emotional. So I'd like to start by asking them some questions, and then I'll open it up to questions from you in the audience. So to start with, Jessica, you said before that growing up you're a voracious reader of nature writing, but you so rarely saw stories like your own. So I wonder if you could tell us about some of the work that inspired you back then, but when you became aware of the extent to which the voices of women and writers of colour were absent.
Yeah, I mean, I think so early on, probably the first book of nature writing I ever read, which is probably common to lots of people, was Silent Spring. I grew up in North America, so I read a lot of North American nature writing at the time. And let me think, that book for me was exciting because it was so narrative, and I really liked the idea of being able to sort of confront complex problems through beautiful writing. That was really important to me. But I don't know, like through my education, I spent a lot of time studying then sort of new nature writing in Britain. And I mean, reading a lot of the sort of the classic stuff, a lot of Richard Mabey, Roger Deakin, Rob McFarlane, all of whom I adore, I should say. But one of the things that felt really absent to me sort of by the time I was probably in my mid-20s, it was really starting to grate for me, was this sort of lack of acknowledgement that when we were talking about land, we were necessarily talking about borders and migration. That was something that seemed really missing from the conversation for me. And so much of the sort of nature writing that I was seeing was so centered on this idea of nativity, of belonging, of sort of a deep-rooted ancestral connection to a single place. And my family has never had that, because while I'm writing about Taiwan in this book, my grandparents were from China. And so they moved to Taiwan in the 1940s and are of a generation that, you know, their own status in Taiwan is problematic and contested and you know, not straightforward. And so for me, at a remove then to say, I grew up in Canada, both my parents are immigrants, my dad's Welsh, my mom's Taiwanese, like that for me is really a deep part of how I approach any landscape that I confront, a deep part of how I, you know, approach the idea of the home landscapes in my life. And so I guess it was just sort of, you know, I felt like that was lacking for a really long time until quite recently. And I think, you know, we have a lot to be optimistic about right now. I really like, I'm not one for hand wringing at this point with it. It's like, there's so many amazing writers. I mean, Amanda's here. I'm so excited. And, you know, people like Elizabeth Jane Burnett, people like Nina Mingya Powell's, like there are people doing incredible work right now at this intersection. I think we're really lucky to be around to witness it. So.
Thanks, Jessica. Yeah, brilliant. So much exciting work around to read. And Amanda, how about you? Did you have a similar experience of growing up? Which were the writers who inspired you into nature reading, and when did you start to really feel this absence?
It's interesting. I don't know if I was really aware of absence in the same way. It's more about how you find the range of things that speak to experience. For me, the range of people that speak to and resonate to who you are in the world. So for me, I mean, I kind of brought up in Scotland, been bird watching since a teenager. So actually, you know, there's nature writers like Seaton Gordons and Dean Thompson who evoke what it is to find birds kind of in the Highlands of Scotland and things like that. And growing up in the west of Scotland in the Central Belt, you know, like at that point growing up, the kind of Scotlands were their exotic and unfamiliar and unreachable place. So it's strange to think back to the books that kind of resonate to me when I was growing up. But certainly the poetry of Norman McCaig was a massive influence, and still, you know, his work still remains a massive influence to me. But it's really interesting because you're always kind of juxtaposing that kind of interest in nature with writers like, for example, Toni Morrison or Audre Lorde, or these different writers that speak to other aspects of your personality. So I think there's something kind of interesting about how each of us in different ways pull these different elements in. So, and as an artist, for example, like Glenn Lagan's work has got massive influence on how I think about words and language and nature, and that kind of interface between how he pulls people like Zora Neale Hurston and James Baldwin into art and things like that. So these kind of moments of connectivity, I think, are really interesting in where you place yourself and how you place yourself and how you find the forms of language or images to fit what it is you're interested in.
Can I say, like, also, Amanda, I think you just articulated perfectly that gap for me, because it's like I spend all of my time reading novels that are sort of diaspora novels, post-colonial literature. That's the stuff I read for fun. And I just saw this huge gap. It's like, why is my nature writing shelf over here like this? And why is like my fiction shelf like this? And why aren't they the same thing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you get to that point, you know, I think with the fantastic work that Jessica's done with Willie Herb Review, with Laurette Savoy's books, you know, there's a whole range of books that now start to speak to these kind of crossovers that, and I think, as Jessica said, we're at this a really exciting point in time where we're not siloing nature with gender, with race, with like Luke Turner's book as well about Epping Forest. You know, like it creates these different dialogues between different facets of personality and place and experience that pull things together.
Absolutely, yeah. But before we come on to talking a bit more about the willow herb, I'm really interested in this idea of interdisciplinarity and taking ideas from so many different places, both fiction and other academic disciplines as well. And Jessica, you've got a PhD in environmental history, and Amanda, you know, you're involved in not just interdisciplinary art making, but you've also explored anthropology and research. I wonder if you could speak a bit about how these different disciplines have affected your thinking and your creative writing. Amanda, do you want to just draw on that?
Well, my PhD was in interdisciplinary arts practice, but it was combined with, I guess, fine art and anthropology in the anthropology department at Aberdeen University. So, I mean, a lot of that kind of thinking, yeah, but I would say my PhD, I was very influenced by a lot of geography and geographical writings as well. But what's really interesting about all that writing is that it kind of embeds you in the landscape. So sometimes a lot of the work is about, like, so for example, in my PhD, the methodology I approached kind of encompassed ethnography and walking ethnographies. So in order for me to learn about place, I walked with foresters and walked with ecologists and other people as they went about their jobs. I volunteered with the RSPB in Abernethy, and I did things like brood counting for capercaillie and mending fences. So all these kind of ways of working kind of embedded me in a landscape in ways that I wouldn't ordinarily or necessarily have embedded myself in landscape by going out singularly as an artist and being in place. So that these kind of ways of thinking, and I guess more academic thinking about mobility and walking, kind of, it certainly influenced my ways of going about making art and ways of going about writing. But what I found really interesting was that while anthropology and geography were trying to conceptualize the experience of being in the world and seeing the world as unfinished and all of these kind of things, and I think dealing with the effectiveness of the world and how the world affects us emotionally, the language of anthropology and the language of geography is so academic that it couldn't, for me, quite make sense in the way that art or creative writing and creative non-fiction could make sense of the world. And I think originally I turned to writing because I was finding art wasn't quite doing exactly what I wanted it to do, and academic writing wasn't doing exactly what I wanted it to do. So my creative writing kind of started from trying to kind of pull both of these things together.
Absolutely, that really resonates with me, having moved from law and academic anthropological research to writing too. And Jessica, you mentioned an environmental historian in the extract you read for us, and I wondered, and I know that you studied a PhD in that subject, and was that a similar concern that caused you to move from academic environmental research into creative writing?
Yeah, I think, it was interesting listening to Amanda describe her PhD work there, because that sounds a whole heck of a lot like my PhD work, which was, also, actually I did a lot of ethnographic research as well during mine, though it was a history PhD. And I think, for me, it's always just been about finding the sort of medium that best suits that sort of replication of the experience that I'm trying to get across, right? And very often for me, that's narrative. And when I was, writing my PhD, I had tried doing a lot of theory at first and then became very theory allergic at a certain point. And then I started just writing my PhD in the first person as a narrative sort of movement through a landscape. And that suddenly worked. And that was sort of where I would say I also sort of found my voice as a writer at that point. Which was great, but it's been this sort of process of occasionally just sort of picking and choosing. And it's, I do a bit of sort of everything at this point. So I'm still doing academic work, but it's, there are times when it's like, I really think that the sort of narrative, nonfiction, literary nonfiction approach for me is, I don't know, it's like my chief mode at this point. But I also, I don't know, like, I love the academic work. I just think very, very often it's quite communicated, right? So, particularly ethnographic research, fieldwork, history, that kind of stuff can be so compelling. And if we could tell those stories effectively, I think, we'd have much wider audiences, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, yeah. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how you your path to publication and how you came to write your first book. So with Jessica, your first book, Turning, was really about wild swimming around Berlin. So yeah, another lovely cover. Perhaps you just talk a bit about how that project emerged, perhaps in conjunction with your academic research, and how you came to publish that.
Yeah, so I had a really strange experience, which I will say, of all the authors I know, is a non-typical experience. So take it with a grain of salt, if you will, which is that, so during my PhD fieldwork, which was here in London, I got a part-time job working on Guardian master classes. I don't know if any of you know of them. And so I was like the events lackey who would get everyone coffee and, get everyone signed up and settled and in their seats and put the microphones on speakers for basically that whole range of creative writing courses. And at that point, I wasn't thinking about it necessarily, but as part of the job, I was sat in the back every day of all of these courses that, I mean, it was a real job perk, actually. I just got to sit in on tons of creative writing courses for about 6 months. And by the end of that, I think I had absorbed enough that I thought, okay, I'm writing this PhD, but I've also learned how to pitch and how to do this and like how to do all these other aspects of different types of writing. And so I thought, okay, I'm gonna, pitch a blog series to this well-known blog. I was living in Berlin at that point. I'd moved back, and I had it in mind that I wanted to spend a year swimming because I wanted to, just not be at my desk all the time while trying to finish my doctorate. And I pitched this blog that I was just going to write about the swims, and that ended up sort of taking off. I think it was where I really sort of figured out what I wanted to do as a writer. And that blog got a lot of attention, and then I, some press attention, and then I got interest from publishers, and then I ended up getting an agent and a book deal. So it was just sort of one of those unexpected things, unplanned, a very quick process, which is, I think, very different than what most authors who are querying agents would find. That being said, I do think for me, it was a really important lesson in sort of putting my work out there, even if I wasn't sure of the shape it was going to take in the long term. And then, yeah, it was just, it was a year of like, just sort of pure discipline, really, because I ended up getting the book deal and then having to write the book and my PhD at the same time. And concurrently, they were finished within a month of one another. And that was, I don't recommend it to anyone ever.
That does sound intense, also a bit familiar. And so after that, then Two Trees seems like a kind of integration then of that what had been two, one creative project and one academic project, almost bringing them together in a focus on nature. Is that how it emerged for you?
Well, I mean, Two Trees was a book that I'd sort of been carrying around in the back of my head for a really long time. But in the end, yeah, as you say, it sort of was a merging of many of my interests. And I feel like, to be honest, that's been the trajectory of my writing career so far is, it's like I took a big departure from what I was trained to do because I wanted to write something just a bit softer, a bit less theoretical. And now I feel like I'm coming back to my own training. But I don't know, I think I've been really excited by the idea that, I've been trained in environmental history. And there's no reason why that content can't appear in a memoir. There's no reason why that content shouldn't appear in a nature writing book. In fact, if it makes, the study of history more exciting to newcomers, then I think that's great. A lot of people tell me they read my books and they'd never heard of environmental history before. And now they're like, I didn't know that was a thing. So I don't know. I think, yeah, finding ways to not necessarily see all those approaches as distinct, but rather as just like the caps I put on every day or the lens that I'm looking at something with. It might be as a nature writer, might be as, a memoirist, it might be as a historian, and actually they can all channel into the same text.
Yeah, absolutely. And Amanda, with the Scots Dictionary, we got a lovely insight from your intro there about how the idea came to you. But I was wondering about the process of researching it and coming up with new words. I mean, there's so many wonderful, rich words in there. I really liked Gaslupa for a grasshopper and Gloaming-Star for an evening star, or Humplock for a small heap of earth. There's so many evocative words. So I wondered if you could just talk a bit about that process of word discovery and also some of the words that particularly perhaps surprised you or have been particularly resonant for you.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because for me, coming across that, I think happenstance is a fascinating thing. I think being open to what's there before you. I came across the old dictionary at a time when I was doing my PhD, and as I said, when I opened it, I came across a word like timber breeks, which is a coffin. And from that point, it made me think about, I wonder what the words for wood are. And because I'm trained as a printmaker, so I do a lot of etching, lithography, screen printing, but actually artist books are a really kind of important part of my practice and have been for years. So the first thing I did with the dictionary after I bought it was to just systematically go through it and pull out all the words I could find, all the words I could find related to wood. And sometimes they were, you know, related to the specificities of, you know, birks and birkshaws as a birchwood. But, you know, there are words for, I can't quite remember, like people that wander through the woods, shawaldaris, or wanderers through woods and things like that, you know. So the first books I made were a series of artist books. So just handmade, kind of sewn, kind of pamphlet stitched artist books that I made. And they sat with me for years, you know. I just, because what I did literally with the dictionaries was just go through them page by page, and any time there was a word for wood, I would pull it out and write it down. And then I did the same with water, with weather, with birds, and eventually kind of the last kind of handmade book I made was about walking. And these kind of sat with me until I thought, actually, I could do something more with them. And it was at that point that I kind of pitched the book. And I think probably like Jessica was really lucky to have it immediately taken up. You know, I didn't have the kind of trauma and stress. And I think because they exist, like for me, they existed, they weren't out in the world, because while I make artist books, I'm terrible at, I don't know if any of my students are listening to this, but as a printmaker, I'm terrible at editioning things. I get bored very quickly. So I'd made a few of them, but I'd never kind of editioned them properly or tried to get them out in the world. So it was really interesting to kind of have the book transform from just a collection of artist books to writing the kind of introductory essay to it becoming a kind of fully fledged kind of hardback book. But there was something really nice about that process of evolution. And I think it's interesting, actually, there's so many parallels, Jessica, I think, between you and me, just about how that gradual transition from one thing to the other and from one form to the other is really quite interesting.
Very interesting, yeah. Before we move to some audience questions, I'd love to talk a little bit about the Willow Herb Review, which Jessica founded and Amanda has contributed to. So Jessica, could you tell us a little bit about founding the Willow Herb and why an inclusive literary space for nature writing remains so important?
Yeah, I think, you know, as I said earlier, I have been and continue to be quite tired of hand-wringing about the state of nature writing. There's so, like, I don't know if you guys kept up with this, but it's like there's a real thing for comment pieces in the broadsheets about the state of nature writing, but never do those comment sheets actually, like comment pieces, you know, platform the writers we want to be hearing from, or do anything to actually constructively improve the genre. So I started the journal in 2018 on a whim, I guess would be the best way to put it. I was frustrated and I tweeted that I wanted to maybe make a space and should I do it? And I got a very enthusiastic response and I thought, shit, now I actually have to do it. So yeah, we crowdfunded, and it's such a basic thing. It's just like a Squarespace website, and we have a budget that, you know, is given to us by lovely people. And we're a pretty small team of, there's 4 of us now. So I've got Dasim Yang, Nicole Dashapara, and Isabel Gallimore on our team, and myself. And basically, yeah, we've just published our 3rd issue. We've also done one special edition issue in addition to that. So basically, we focus on nature writing from writers of color around the world. And we're really open to like what that can look like. I think, you know, we really wanted to I think, shift an understanding of nature writing as being just this one sort of stuffy thing, as I think we're all used to seeing it, particularly on the display tables in Waterstones or wherever, right? Like, it's like they all have the same book cover. There's always like a wax coat and a dog and some moors and whatever. We wanted to sort of break that mold. And it's been really exciting to see what we get, because we get things from all around the world. We get, fiction, nonfiction, poetry on topics and styles, in styles that, perhaps might not immediately seem like nature writing to some people, but I would argue very strongly are. Amanda contributed to was it our first one, Amanda? Yeah, and you came to me with a video, and I was so excited about it. So I loved the idea, it's not the only video we've published now, so I like the idea of the sort of disruption that this creates in the nature writing space.
Absolutely, yeah. I will, in fact, take this moment to post a link to the Willow Herb in the chat, so anyone who hasn't come across it can have a look and browse some of the amazing writing. Amanda, would you like to talk to us a little bit about your contribution to the Willow Herb, your video, what it involved, and your experience?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's a video and a I don't know, would you call it a short flash non-fiction piece or something? So it's a video of coal tits at a feeder and just a kind of paragraph about it. And it's interesting for me because it has both elements of art and writing attached to it. And I think I'm generally really interested in how the visuals can pause writing and how writing can add to the visuals. And what was really lovely was Jessica's response to it was immediately enthusiastic, and it was really clear that it was neither, or it was that combination of art and writing together, and how each of the pieces added a different layer to what was there already. And I think for me, the Willow Herb Review has that capacity to blur boundaries that need to be blurred, to add these layers of experience and connection and connectivity between the authors and the landscapes or whatever it is they're writing about. But actually there's something about that resonance that these writers have with you. So while you might be in a completely different place, in a completely different country, you might be living rurally or living in the city, but there's something there that resonates with you. And I think quite often, when Jessica's talking about the hand-wringing of nature writing, it can be posited as a kind of us and them. Whereas actually, I think there's a lot of connectivity that becomes really important. And when we think about diversity in nature writing, or diversity in general, I think quite often what we come out with is that there's more that holds us together or connects us, that pulls us apart. And I think what's really lovely again about the Willow Herb Review is it's there for everybody. It's not just Black people writing for Black people or people of colour writing for other people of colour. There's a connectivity there that should relate to absolutely everybody with an interest in, and that's the thing, not even just an interest in nature and nature writing, because I think the Willow Herb Review doesn't silo nature writing into that. It just is writing, and it's about life.
Yeah, great point, Amanda. And connecting diversity to biodiversity, just reflecting on the role of nature writing and a world facing a climate crisis, a biodiversity crisis. Could you both speak to how you feel that literary nature writing can contribute to perhaps changing people's attitudes, behaviours, what difference it can make? Jessica?
Yeah, I think, at least from my perspective, and as someone writing sort of, I guess now within Britain and within that sort of context and tradition, what I've tried to see in the Willow Herb and in my own writing, and, when I work with other writers in particular, is this sense of an awareness of nature writing not being neutral. It's not neutral in any means, right? By any means. and we need at times to dial up the sort of politicization of it, I think, in some way, because there are very high stakes, and we need to actually make explicit that how we represent or replicate, the more than human world on the page has huge implications in terms of policy decisions, in terms of people's attitudes, in terms of, the stories that actually get told about the natural world. I always come back to this example, so forgive me if you've already heard me talk, and I've said this before. But I, for writing Two Trees, spent a lot of time looking at Taiwanese nature writing. And what struck me about that was that Taiwanese nature writing emerged in the 1980s during a period in which people were fighting for democracy and the sort of the end of martial law in Taiwan. And so this conservation movement, the nature writing movement, and the movement for democracy are all entwined there and cannot be sort of separated from one another. So, we've got writers and bird watchers who couldn't go out and use binoculars because they would have been arrested as spies, right, for espionage. And the idea that, it's not a given, and that, to be able to write about nature, to act as a conservationist or an environmental activist, they're not given things, and they're deeply tied to, say, democracy or other political forms, and we need to explicitly understand nature writing within a political context. I don't know that.
Again, such a good point. And Amanda, is there anything you'd like to speak to on that issue of the role of nature writing and addressing, not just the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis on their own, but as Jessica's saying, the political context that's around both of them?
I think it's always difficult as a writer and artist to know exactly what you're like when it's placed in this creative sphere, exactly what you actually will be able to do. Sometimes I think for me it can just be about noticing and drawing things to people's attention. But when Jessica was talking, I was thinking about a fabulous book by Yusuf, A Billion Black Anthropocenes. I don't know if people have read that, but I mean, it's a phenomenal book. And what that did to me was to turn things on its head. So, for example, we are now in the Anthropocene, but she'll place it in the context of, well, if you think about the Industrial Revolution, think about the black bodies that were implicated in the Industrial Revolution and the exploitation that happened for working class people in the UK and beyond, but with slavery, with indentured labour, etc., the implications of industry to black bodies in the world. If we're placing the Anthropocene, as some people do, at the beginning of the 1950s, when there was nuclear testing and things like that, think about the amount of people that were displaced from atolls in the Pacific and things like that. These real questions of how we writing can pull connections that we might not otherwise notice and pull them into the here and now and potential future perspectives on where we are and where we might go. So for me, it's about the potential for connectivity, and sometimes it's political and sometimes it's overtly political, but it doesn't always necessarily have to be to draw attention to what needs to be drawn attention to.
Absolutely, thanks so much. So now questions from the audience. I have an advanced question from Sky Fruin that's related to that. Sky, would you like to ask your question in person? If so, please feel free to turn on your mic and go ahead, otherwise I can ask it for you. There, Sky? All right, well, I will ask it on your behalf then. Sky's asked, coming from a position of privilege in the global north, when writing about biodiversity crisis, how can we decenter our own voices as writers and speak impactfully to issues of environmental catastrophe? So a question about decentering voices, I suppose, and is there anything you'd like to say in answer to that, Jessica?
So I think, immediately when I think of this question, I think of the work of Anna Singh as a really great bar to set for ourselves in terms of speaking for the more than human world, or as much as we can, but also you know, centering perspectives sort of on a global scale in terms of understanding many points of connection, right? Like it's not just the global north that needs its stories told, not just the global south, but actually we need to tell the stories of how they're connected, often in very extractive ways, right? So I think actually coming back, we keep coming back to ethnography here today, but I think ethnography has a lot to offer on that front. And just, you know, I think we can sort of reimagine as writers what the forms our writing might take could be. You know, I like the idea of giving voice to things in different ways. I'm gonna mention something Amanda did earlier in the year for Ariel Festival. I commissioned Amanda to write a piece, and that was a piece that sort of fused sort of a piece of political meditation and writing on the current moment with like an incredible wealth of just very still, very calm video pieces of the landscape nearby. And that for me was a really great moment because, or sort of form, because it fused, you know, the writer's perspective, I think also with just sort of allowing the natural world to sort of be with us in this way that was very sustained and sort of made visible things we might not otherwise see. So I think there is this sort of need to clear space, but as writers, as artists, thinking about what that looks like, maybe that means, you know, listening, it might mean observing, it might mean giving platforms to others and sustainable platforms where they get paid to do their work or get compensated properly to do their work. I think this is sort of a multidimensional thing. I don't, that was like a lot of answers at once.
No, fascinating. Thank you, Jessica. I'll ask Amanda to speak to that. In the meantime, if anyone else would like to ask a question, would you like to either post it in the chat and I will try to get to them, or if you want to use the reactions button and perhaps do a clap reaction, I could try to see you and come to you that way. Amanda, would you like to speak to that question?
I mean, I think I'm probably repeating myself in some ways, but I think space for other voices. You know, I think it's that kind of importance of space for other voices, and as Jessica says, valuing other voices, and sometimes it has to be monetarily. But I think creating space for dialogue and connectivity, I think feels to me to be the most important thing to do, because we're all just in our little parts of the world, but we have to hear and see what else is going on. So what are the ways that we can create spaces to hear other people? You know, I'm thinking of, there's a book, and I can't remember the name, but it's got a wonderful title called If This Is Your Land, Where Are Your Stories? And the idea of how you hear the stories of people from these different places and experiences of these different places from the past to the present and into the future.
Thanks. Yeah, absolutely. Great. Well, I've got a question here in the chat from Caitlin Kite. Would you like to ask your question and unmute yourself?
Yeah, sure.
Great.
So my question was, going back to the comments that both of you have talked, where you've talked about the different words. So you've each quoted very specific words from different languages or different vernaculars. And for me, it was kind of evocative of the recent book, The Lost Words, which is all focused on these words that we're no longer teaching our students here in the UK. And all of that kind of makes me think about it's the extent to which nature writing in general can influence people's thoughts on nature and spaces, and the extent to which it's like particular vocabulary used within that nature writing that is creating that response. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are about that, whether it's, you know, general writing or writing using specific words, or a combination of those two things.
Thank you, Caitlin. Jessica, would you like to speak to that?
Can I throw this to Amanda first, because Amanda has done the dictionary? I feel like this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Certainly for me, when I was coming across Scott's words, they connected me in a way that I was really aware that there'd been a loss of connections. So a lot of the immediate words and metaphors related to nature. For example, there's a lovely word called to spurry how, which means to run as fast as a sparrowhawk flies. And words like that immediately speak to a connection that we don't necessarily have anymore, because our metaphors potentially or connections relate to the digital world or living in cities or things like that. You know, like most of us will live kind of in urban settings. We have electricity, so we don't need to think about what's the word for that space between daylight ending and the candles needing to go on. You know, like we don't have the kind of nuances perhaps that we used to need to have. So the immediate connectivity with nature isn't necessarily there. So what was lovely for me to go into a Scots dictionary and to find these words was there was a connection to place that made me pause and look differently. Like I was on a program the other day and I was saying I can't help but look at trees when they're blowing in the wind and not think of them as flouncing now. You know, like there's been words that for me pull everydayness into sharp relief and make me think about things in a way I hadn't really thought about them or noticed them before. So I suppose it's that kind of pause in how language, it's like poetry as well, you know, just poetry kind of will pull you in and I don't know, see things at a slant, I suppose, in a really lovely way.
Yeah, thank you. And I have a very snappy question from Ellen, which I will put to you now, Jessica. How do you define nature writing?
I don't know if I would define it. I think I feel like it's a very fuzzy, woolly thing. And there are a lot of nature writers who would bristle at being called nature writers. They do not like the term. I think any kind of writing that engages in a sensory way with our experience of the world, be it urban or rural or, you know, wild, I will put that in big air quotes. I think that ostensibly all could count as nature writing. I think for me, the key thing I would look for is that sensory component, that sense of sort of visceral connection and experience. And yeah, I guess we need as many words as we possibly could have for all of those experiences and all the gaps between them, and you know, to find areas where the words don't translate to one another, if that makes sense.
Great, wonderful. And perhaps the final question as we're coming to the end of our time, from Adam, who's asked, how has poetry in poetic form inspired your prose writing? Perhaps you could both speak to that. Amanda, would you like to talk about that?
That's interesting. It's not something that I think of particularly. I read poetry, as I say. Norman McCaig in particular has always been a huge kind of influence in my writing. I suppose if anything, it's the attention to detail and how the smallest detail can expand into a phenomenal meditation. That for me is what kind of Norman McCaig's work does. But I think you can see it in, you know, how Nan Shepherd and the kind of poetics of The Living Mountain. Yeah, just that, how these moments can be expanded in ways that you would ordinarily think you might just kind of skip past them.
Thank you. Yeah, and Jessica, particular poems or poetic forms inspired your prose?
Yeah, I read a lot of poetry, particularly when I'm writing. Often poetry is the only thing I can read when I'm working on a project. It's like trash TV and poetry. But I think for me, you know, because of so much of what I'm trying to do as a writer is very often to catch moments in movement. I find poetry very helpful for thinking about rhythm, for thinking about, you know, replicating movement on a page. Which is why I think it's the thing I'm most conscious of as a writer is how things sound. and why I always tell writers to read their work aloud and to find that rhythm. And if you're not finding a movement bodily almost with your writing, then something's off. That for me is like the key component.
Absolutely, I always go on about that to my writing students too. Wonderful. Okay, I'm afraid we've got to the end of this rich and fascinating hour. Thank you so much for joining us, Jessica and Amanda and everyone in the audience. It's been a really wonderful session. I'd encourage you all to buy Jessica and Amanda's books from indie bookshops or bookshop.org and read more about their fascinating work on their websites. I hope you can all join us next week for the next event in the series. That will be poetry themed, and it's going to feature two extraordinary poets, Vani Capildeo and Nisha Ramaya. But for now, perhaps you could join me by turning on your mics for a few seconds and giving Jessica and Amanda a round of applause to finish.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank
Thank you so
you.
much. See you all soon. Bye.
Bye.